I will begin with a story which I think will lead us into the idea of imago in Carl Jung. Carl Jung, who died in 1961. And then after that, I'll bring in how imago, or some ways imago, appears in the writings of Thomas Aquinas, who lived in the 1200s, a medieval thinker. This story is a likely story. I don't think to be taken too literally, but it's one way of looking at human development, or a story that some people have told about humans in their development and consciousness, awareness, and knowledge. So the story says that way back, once upon a time, humans first lived in a more dreamlike existence. Dreamlike in that their experience, our experience of life, the world around us, of other things in the world, of other people, was a mixture of inner and outer that we naively believed was all outer, so that when humans experienced and talked about the outer world, it included much of what was actually within them projected onto the outer world. So this is sometimes given the term participation mystique, this dreamlike existence of humans. And the process of gradually awakening from this dream, this participation mystique, had a particular powerful moment in Western history in Copernicus. Copernicus being the astronomer who had more reasons and convinced people that the movement that humans thought and experienced as being in the sun was actually in us, the earth, where we live. So for all these thousands upon thousands of years, humans had been experiencing and talking about the sun moving around the earth, and suddenly they discovered and awoke to the fact that no, that movement that they had projected outside, far outside themselves, was actually their own movement. They were turning and moving around the sun. So this awakening called the Copernican Revolution becomes a metaphor for humans continuing to awaken to the fact that things they had projected into the outer world, into their outer experience, were actually internal things being projected onto the screen of the outer world. And the philosopher Immanuel Kant saw himself as continuing this. He himself used that image as a metaphor, a Copernican revolution, that he was continuing a Copernican revolution, and claimed to show that even more things that humans thought were part of the outer world were actually part of our own inner world, our inner structures, that we took data coming in through our faculties and reorganized them, added to them, and then went back and talked as if those were in the outer world. So some of the things he talked about were the physics of the time, Newtonian physics, Newtonian absolute space-time, which he said, and to this extent, it seems right to me that this absolute mathematical Newtonian space-time was not actually out in the world, but was something he thought maybe part of us, maybe more a kind of a construct, perhaps more likely, that we made and used to think about the world. But in this story of the continuing awakening of humans from their dream, their participation mystique, we move on, and another outstanding figure in this story is Carl Jung. And Carl Jung applied or enacted the Copernican revolution even more in our very ordinary particular life and in our relationships with other people. So when he was one time having a conversation with Sigmund Freud asked him what he thought about the ideas of projection and transference in psychoanalysis, and Jung said he thought they were the alpha and omega of the whole process in this new psychology. And Freud was delighted to hear that. He said, yeah, you got it. But what is it that then, what are being projected from our inner world onto the outer world? One of the names Jung gave to these things were imagos. Imago being the Latin word for image, so taking the Latin word for image and applying it to a particular kind of image, images within our souls, in our psyches. Psyche being just the Greek word for soul. So these inner soul images, then given the Latin name imago, are the things that we mostly unconsciously project and attribute to the outer world and act in the world, act toward others, other things, other people, without realizing that we are actually engaging to a great extent not with the other actual person or thing, but with the imago of that person or thing that exists not out in them, but in our own soul or psyche. And it seems that this one of the sources for this use of the term imago was from a novel called Imago, which was about a man who briefly meets a woman, and then they part, and he forms this idealistic image of her in his soul, and starts to act in the world and toward her as if toward this imago. Carl Jung put quite a bit of thought into trying to understand what made up these imagos and how they were generated in our souls. And there seem, if I understand him, to be three main elements that make up the imago, and the first being things drawn from our own experience, our own a sense experience of the world or of another person. So, but not just what comes from, say, the other person, say a man and his wife, and the imago that he has of his wife and his soul is drawn not just from his experiences of her, but experiences that have a likeness to his experience of her. So, for example, the man's mother, and his experience of his mother will enter in to his imago of his wife, and so he will feel and act, behave toward his wife, not just toward her as she is in himself, but as she is in his imago, which includes much that is drawn from his mother. One example, I like to kind of find examples of this in art and literature and film. And one film, if you're interested, that I think involves and shows a lot of this is a Russian film by Andrei Tarkovsky called Mirror, and the relation between his mother and his wife in his soul. So besides the elements drawn from our experience and our experience of the thing or the person, and of things that seem alike, are kind of gathered by likeness or association, there's also, Jung said, a motivating emotional energy or charge to the imago. So it's not just a picture or an image, but it has what he called a psychic energy and an emotional charge that involves that image in how whether we feel safe or threatened, whether it seems beneficial or harmful. And a third ingredient in the imago comes from our instinctual evolutionary inheritance, so that the image we have of things and people connects with our whole evolutionary past and instincts about and behavior patterns about acting and feeling in the world. Henry James once said that when two people are together talking, there are actually 6 people present. There are who each of those 2 people are. There's who each of them thinks the other is, and who each thinks they themselves are. So then there's the 2 people, and then, to use Jung's language, there are the imagos, both of the other and the imagos they have of themselves. So that when we think about and relate to ourselves, it's also through an imago of ourselves. Now, Thomas Aquinas, I believe, talks about these same things with his own context and language. And one of the places it comes up is where he's talking about motivation. Motivation of things that have awareness, sense, understanding, perception, and that can move themselves through space, for example. When he's talking in the broad context about how things in the universe move one another and act upon one another, he gets to that specific area of things with perception and a special kind of self-motion. And he asks of these things that have desiring and wanting and willing, what moves their desires, what moves their will, what moves their choices? What is the mover? What is the motivation? One might say, well, it's the thing that's desired, the desirable thing, the desirable object that moves. So when I smell a pizza, then I want the pizza. Or when someone sees an attractive person, a man sees a beautiful woman, a woman sees a handsome, charming man, then the person desires, is attracted to, wants that person. So then it's that desirable object that moves our desire and will. And Aquinas says, well, partly, but you have to say more. It's not the thing itself that directly moves the wanting, the willing, but there's something in between that more directly moves the desire, the will. And that is what he calls the form in apprehension, the inner form within the soul, or we could say the image in the soul. So in his language, he'll say there's the form of the thing, the form in the thing, that object or that person's shapes and qualities and what they really are. And then there's the form in the apprehension, in the being that has perception and awareness and thought, if they have thought. He says what moves the desire or the wanting or the will is not immediately and directly the object in the outer world, but is the form in the soul, the form that thing has in the soul of the seeker or desirer. And so we could also use the term an inner image. And in the whole universe of beings and the chain of being, this in-between realm of inner images and inner forms arises when you get to things with perception and consciousness. So before that, in the world of nature and just we might say more pure physical objects, it is the objects themselves and their forms and qualities that they themselves possess that are interacting with and motivating each other and acting upon and moving each other. But once these beings with sense and awareness and apprehension come in, there enters into the universe a whole nother world of forms and images, inner psychic images, forms within the soul. And this new realm, if we to kind of as a way of describing it, a whole new world of inner images, has much to do with the way we live and experience the world, and Aquinas will use this to kind of talk about and untie other questions and problems about the world regarding truth and falsehood, illusion, deception, and evil, and problem of evil, of good and bad. So in the human world, we notice, and people think about and wonder about why there is, in a kind of new and different way in the human world and arena, this phenomenon of humans wanting what is good, seeming to kind of innately desire what is good, happiness, health, wellness, but making choices and acting for things that are not good, that are bad, that are harmful for themselves and for others or for the world. And doing this in a way and to an extent that we don't see in the world of kind of pure nature. And Aquinas says, well, one of the reasons for this, or ways of understanding and explaining this, is that you have to be aware that it's not the objects themselves and their own inherent forms that are directly moving us humans in our desires and choices, but it is the inner forms, the inner images we have of things, and that those are not exactly the same. And so that can lead to people pursuing things and paths that in their soul and mind and imagination they believe are good but are not really good. The Bible says that there are paths that seem good to humans but which lead to death. So this world of seeming, the way things seem as distinct from the way they are, that whole realm of seeming, appearing, of appearances, is this in-between world that Aquinas says is what directly is moving and motivating us. This whole experience and world of seeming, of appearance, of charm, is the world which fairy tales address, where things seem good but turn out to be bad. The gingerbread house looks wonderful, looks like the place to settle, and it's actually the house of a witch. Or the apple offered to Snow White is very desirable and attractive, but it's poison and kills her. Or things that seem repulsive or bad are really good for us. So the prince, the handsome noble prince, first seems like a frog, and the princess wants to flee from him. So the world, this in-between world of the images in the soul, is what gives rise to the difference between what the ancients called the real, true good and the apparent good. And that we can be led around by the apparent good. After talking about Jung and Aquinas, I'd like to talk a little bit about the projective quality of these inner forms or images. It seems like there's a certain inborn or spontaneous tendency to project them. Jung would say it's done unconsciously. And I think there's some truth to that and some reason for that. And so look at two reasons, one on the part of the will and desire and one on the part of knowledge. And on the part of our will and desire, Aquinas points out, well, it's not, even though it's the inner form or image of the thing that directly moves my desiring, willing powers, what I want is not the inner image, but I want the thing in the world. So those inner images have a outward direction. And we can think of examples where there's a positive function, not just the illusory aspect of it, but the image of a partner that a person projects and looks for to find in the outer world leads the person out into the outer world on a search and to engage and to learn in the world and to relate more to others and to find, say, a partner, which leads to a family and a whole life. So these inner images have a tendency, an outer tendency, because what we want and will is not the image, but what is in the outer world. And also on the part of knowledge, if we use an analogy of these inner forms and images and how they relate to the actual outer world or an outer person, if we take an analogy from mathematics, there is a process in mathematics of trying to approach a circle by inscribed polygons, inscribed figures with straight sides. So you start with a triangle inscribed in the circle and see, well, that is still not quite equal to the circle, so divide it up the sides and make a hexagon that's closer to the circle. And the more you multiply the sides and the more points of contact with the circle, the closer you get to the circle. But in this process, you never actually reach or duplicate the circle. And I like to see that as an image for our inner forms, our inner images of the world in relation to the world, or our inner images of a person in relation to that person. So imagine the circle to be another person, and the inscribed straight-sided figures to be my images and thoughts about the person. And they are, as I learn more and more, they're approaching who the person really is, what they're really like, but they never totally match because there are always an infinite number of points still left to match up. The straight-sided figure never completely equals the circle. So there's always an unlimited amount of unknown in another person, and certainly in the whole universe, if we thought of the circle as the actual universe and the inscribed figures as our images and maps of the universe. Or to use one more mathematical example of an equation, suppose my thoughts and images about you are all the one side of the equation, the other side is you. And in my equation, which I'm trying to get equal to you, there are many variables with unknown values. So we might say, well, just leave those values unknown. That kind of a speculative approach. Try to identify what is known and leave all the unknowns as unknown variables. But can we really do that? It seems there's a certain inclination or spontaneous tendency to fill in the unknowns. That our imagination just fills in what's unknown to us. One reason for that is that we have to act in the world and toward one another in ways that assume how safe or threatening this other thing or person is, how helpful or harmful that this outer object is, and all sorts of other kind of assumptions that we need in order to act. And the imagination itself has a tendency to just fill things in. So the writer C.S. Lewis took a trip out to visit an uncle of his. And when he got there and his uncle picked him up off the train, and as he was seeing the village, C.S. Lewis said, "Oh my gosh, it's very different than what I imagined it to be." And the uncle said, "Well, what right did you have to imagine it to be anything at all?" Of course he didn't, because he had never been there, he had never seen it, but we imagine the town where someone lives or the house where they live. And then when we actually see it, we often have that reaction, oh, it's not what I imagined it to be. And of course it isn't, but the imagination fills in the unknown, often by means of likenesses. So I meet a person, I'm not quite sure how to react, and this is very much unconscious, but I react to them based on some likeness. There's an association by likeness of that person to another person. And so people experience that, like, before even knowing the person at all, spontaneously liking them or disliking them. And that's based on say, an association, a likeness, and the imagination then will fill in the unknown. So even on the part of knowing and acting in the world, there seem to be some spontaneous tendencies to project these inner images onto the outer world, and to some extent a necessity to do so. So we have looked at in an introductory way this idea of imago in Jung and in Aquinas, starting with this story of humans slowly awakening from a participation mystique, a dream-like experience where things are inner and outer is very mixed together. And Jung also thought and I think observed in some way that this does seem to happen through even an individual's life, that as we go through life and get older, this mixture of inner and outer, of dream and reality, starts to separate, we become more able, and we can also contribute to that by our own reflection and effort. We become more able to see the imagos for what they are and disentangle them from objects and things, and not get rid of them. They are an enrichment of life, but also not naively project and live in excessively in these projections. Here we wander in illusions, said Shakespeare. We saw that Aquinas, this intermediate world of inner forms that move and motivate us and engage our desires and our wanting, arises in the universe when we have things with soul and a perceiving, aware soul. So Jung would say things like psyche is image, soul is image. I think in a way of expressing this same insight of Aquinas, that this whole realm of inner forms and images arises when you have perceiving souls.